Hi, and welcome back to another video on one of the most important documents from early Christianity, the Gospel of John. In this video, we're going to be zeroing in on chapters 1 to 12 of John, John's Book of Signs, and looking at the internal structure of that section. Along the way, we're going to see how John uses Israel's calendar of sacred time to give not only structure but meaning to those stories. In the last video, we saw why scholars generally divide John overall into three large sections, with a brief prologue and an epilogue in chapter 21. From 1:19 through to the end of chapter 12, we often call this section the Book of Signs, where Jesus announces his identity publicly to Israel, both in his speeches and in acts of divine power. This is followed in chapters 13 to 17 by the farewell scene, a focused account of Jesus' last private evening with his disciples before his arrest. The gospel then culminates in chapters 18 to 20, with the trial, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus, a sequence that's presented by John not as a shameful defeat, but as precisely the opposite, the moment in which God's divine glory is fully revealed by Jesus. But what structure can we recognize within these large sections? If we look more closely at the Book of Signs in particular, can we detect a finer level of structure within it? The Book of Signs is unified by themes and narrative patterns that run consistently through the whole section, but there are more subtle transitions and turning points along the way. We quite naturally sense that these chapters consist of distinct episodes in the story. There's the episode of Jesus calling his first disciples, then the episode of the wedding at Cana, then the episode of Jesus driving out the temple merchants, followed by the episode of Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus, etc., etc., right up to chapter 12. And with most of these episodes, there's wide agreement about where one ends and the next begins. Why? Well, because we're sensing intuitively the same signals of transition that we were looking at before when we looked at the whole structure of John. How do we know that a new episode is beginning in chapter 2, verse 1? That verse introduces a change in setting. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. Prior to this verse, we've just been down in Judea, near the Jordan River, with the disciples of John the Baptist, watching a few of them meet Jesus and decide to follow him. Now we make a geographic leap northwards to Cana in western Galilee. The situation is no longer John the Baptist's prophetic activity with his disciples. Now we've shifted to a wedding. The new disciples of Jesus are still present, but where they'd been seen at the center of things in chapter 1, now they recede to the edges of the scene. The individuals, Philip and Nathanael, Andrew and Peter, no longer appear as individuals, replaced with a generic group character labeled the disciples. Instead, the action centers around a new series of characters: Jesus' mother, the household servants, the steward, and the bridegroom. The time also jumps forward 3 days from the end of chapter 1. As is common at a transition point like this, the narrative pacing briefly accelerates. Days whip past in the space of a few words, before narrative time slows again in the midst of the wedding celebrations, and the events of the new episode begin. It's not unusual to have one or two of these shifts in the middle of an episode, but when we see several such shifts coinciding at the same point, we naturally sense that a new episode has begun. We should also add that a transition between episodes usually involves some break in the causal sequence of events. Within an episode, each event is related to the one that came before it. A wedding is being celebrated, so wine runs out. So Jesus' mother asks him to help. So Jesus transforms the water. So the groom is amazed at its quality. This is not a strictly logical chain of causation, but one event is clearly a contributing factor to the next. There's no such link, though, between the end of chapter 1 and the events at Cana that follow. Nothing in John the Baptist's ministry prompts the marriage in Cana. Nothing about the disciples' new commitment to Jesus leads to the lack of wine or to the demand of Jesus' mother. So we effortlessly recognize in 2 verse 1 the beginning of a new narrative episode. Not only are there coinciding shifts in setting, character, and pacing, but there's also a break in the causal sequence. A new chain of related events begins. Still, most would agree that John's Book of Signs is more than just a flat sequence of individual episodes. Between the level of individual episodes and the level of the whole Book of Signs, there's a middle level of structure. Unifying elements tie together smaller sets of episodes. What are these unifying elements? What holds together these subsets of episodes? In many subsets, they're just the same narrative features that give unity to larger sections of the book that can also, in a more limited way, give a measure of unity to smaller collections. For example, if we look carefully at the stories and speeches in chapters 7, 8, and 9, we notice that they all take place in the same location, the temple courts in Jerusalem. What's more, they all take place within the span of a short few days. This encourages us to read the speeches of 7 to 8 and the healing of the blind man in chapter 9 together as parts of one subsection of the Book of Signs. These episodes are linked directly by time and location. In chapter 6, then, we find a sequence of episodes that are directly linked both by travel and by causation. Jesus feeds the multitude, and in response, the crowd tries to acclaim him as king. To avoid them, Jesus goes on his own up the mountain. Because they're left by themselves and the time is getting late, the disciples then head home to Capernaum across the Sea of Galilee. And it's during that trip that Jesus catches up to them walking on the water. The next day, some of the crowds who had been fed by Jesus find him again in Capernaum, and Jesus teaches them, referring in the process to the miracle that they witnessed the day before. The direct links in space and causal sequence here encourage us to read the episodes together, again, as another subsection. But these direct narrative links aren't the only way John structures the Book of Signs. One of the main structuring devices John uses is Israel's cycle of sacred time. If we pay attention to the transitional summary statements in John, one of the things we'll notice is how often they connect events to Israel's sacred calendar. We aren't simply told that an episode takes place in a certain month or on a certain day. We're told that the episode takes place during one of Israel's major festivals. In fact, these time signals explicitly relate every one of the events in the Book of Signs to a sacred time, from the end of chapter 2 through to chapter 12. And in some cases, Jesus goes out of his way to remind us that multiple episodes are all taking place around the same festival time. After the episode of the wedding in Cana, John begins the next section by situating the temple clearing episode in the temporal context of a festival. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. At the end of that same episode, he provides a summary statement about Jesus' activity. When he was in Jerusalem during the Passover festival, many believed in his name because they saw the signs he was doing. This leads directly to the long episode of Jesus' encounter with Nicodemus. Indeed, Nicodemus seems to be introduced precisely as one of those who came to believe during the festival. So these two episodes are linked by their taking place in the context of the same festival. After that, we might easily forget about Passover for the next couple of episodes. We have the scene with John the Baptist in chapter 3, verses 22 to 36. Then Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at the well in chapter 4. Toward the end of chapter 4, though, John deliberately reminds us that the people around Jesus still haven't forgotten his words and actions at the festival. When the 2 days were over, he went from that place to Galilee, for Jesus himself had testified that a prophet has no honor in the prophet's own country. When he came to Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him, since they had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the festival, for they too had gone to the festival. Here, As we finish Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman and her village, John's transitional summary reminds us why he was traveling through Samaria in the first place. It's still mere days after the Passover, and Jesus passed through the Samaritan's territory on his way back home to Galilee. In retrospect, John deliberately ties the episode of the Samaritan woman together with the episodes of Nicodemus and the temple clearing as a cluster of events taking place around the Passover pilgrimage. In case this link were not clear enough, John then closes with a scene deliberately crafted to echo the wedding at Cana. In the last section of chapter 4, Jesus, freshly back from Jerusalem with the other Passover pilgrims, returns to Cana and heals a royal official's son. John specifies at the end of the story that this was the second sign that Jesus did after coming from Judea to Galilee. With this final line of chapter 4, John ensures that we are thinking of this as another narrative turning point like the wedding at Cana. Everything from Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem and the temple clearing through to this new sign in Galilee is framed as part of Jesus' journey south. And what was the focus of that journey? The celebration of the Passover that John highlighted so deliberately early on and again here in chapter 4. So we find a subsection within the book of signs, stretching from chapter 2 verse 13, after the first sign at Cana, through to 4:54 and the second sign at Cana. This is a subsection that's framed as one pilgrimage journey to and from Jerusalem for Passover. In case we might be tempted to think that we're overplaying the Passover connection, notice how Passover takes center stage again in chapter 6. As we saw a few moments ago, this chapter relates Jesus' feeding of the multitude, his walking on the water, and the speech that follows. The three episodes happen one right after the other, and they're linked directly by travel and by causal sequence. Now, notice that all three events take place around the Sea of Galilee in the north, and none of them bears any direct relation to celebrating a festival. So it's striking that John goes out of his way to point out at the beginning where we stand in Israel's sacred calendar. Now, the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. Once John has placed the Passover festival in our minds, the symbolic connections between these episodes and the festival are impossible to miss. The Passover, after all, remembered and reenacted Israel's exodus from slavery in Egypt. That journey took the people through the wilderness of Sinai, where God fed them miraculously with manna. John highlights the echoes of this story when he points out that this multitude is in the wilderness, when Jesus once again provides them with food. Having put Passover and the Exodus in our minds, John's description of Jesus walking across the waves seems to recall the description of God in Exodus 15, leading Israel through the Dead Sea. We'll talk more about this symbolism when we focus on chapter 6 in detail. The point, for the moment, is simply that John deliberately ties this trio of episodes to the celebration of Passover and lets the festival's symbolism interpret the meaning of Jesus' words and actions. John's fixation on Israel's festivals continues at the opening of chapter 7, where we find Jesus traveling south once again, this time for the festival of Sukkot, the festival of tabernacles or booths. All the events of chapters 7, 8, and 9 are clearly set by John in and around the temple courts during this festival. And once again, John seems to rely on the festival's symbolism to add implied significance to what Jesus says and does. It's here that Jesus announces, "Let anyone who's thirsty come to me, and let the one who believes in me drink. As the scripture has said, out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water." John makes sure to tell us that Jesus did this on the last day of the festival, the great day. And on that day, Jesus' talk about flowing water and drinking clearly echo the festival rituals. The priests would carry water from the pool of Siloam up to the temple, representing the water God gave Israel to drink in the desert. Likewise, on the same day, Jesus declares in the temple courts, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Anyone who'd been to Jerusalem during Sukkot could hardly miss the allusion here to the enormous lamp that was erected in the temple courts at night, representing God's presence with Israel in the pillar of fire. Even the healing of the blind man in chapter 9, set during this festival, takes on added significance. Jesus, the light of the world, provides spiritual sight for Israel, just as the pillar of fire guided them through the wastes of the Exodus. Then, midway through the Good Shepherd discourse of chapter 10, John seems to skip forward once again from Sukkot directly to another festival. At that time, the festival of the dedication took place in Jerusalem. Dedication is, of course, another name for the festival of Hanukkah. This wasn't one of Israel's ancient biblical festivals. It was a more recent practice that commemorated the rededication of the temple in 164 BCE. The Syrian king, who at that point controlled Judea, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, had outlawed Torah and tried to force Jews to abandon their devotion to God. Instead, they revolted, and under the leadership of Judas Maccabeus, Judas the Hammer, the Jewish rebels pushed out the Syrian army and re-established an independent Jewish state that was even more fiercely devoted to Israel's God than ever. Once again, there's no reason for John to mention the festival here, except to evoke its themes as a context for Jesus' words and actions. Scholars disagree about exactly which verses should still be read against the backdrop of Sukkot, and which John wants to frame with the themes of Hanukkah. Many want to insist that a new section, oriented towards Hanukkah, doesn't begin until 1022. They thus put a hard section boundary down the middle of chapter 10. And it's true that there's a jump in time at 1022. But aside from that jump in time, the whole chapter reads like one extended set of speeches. The theme of shepherds and sheep begins at the start of chapter 10 and continues after 1022. So I tend to think that scholars are, at this point, often too reliant on the model of an outline with sharp boundaries. In the middle of a speech about good and bad shepherds, about a good shepherd caring for his sheep, John mentions Hanukkah. Israel's leaders, its kings and prophets, had for centuries been challenged as bad shepherds who didn't protect their flock, Israel. The prophets looked forward to a better shepherd for the people, a king like David. And this question of leadership was precisely what was raised again during the Maccabean revolt against Syria. For many, the whole crisis had been caused by the corruption of Israel's shepherds, the high priestly elites of Jerusalem, during the 2nd century BCE. Judas Maccabeus was for them the epitome of the Good Shepherd, who refused to compromise in his devotion to God and so led the people to freedom. Even though Hanukkah isn't introduced until verse 22, the audience still has the speeches of 10 verses 1 to 21 in mind. We are right in the midst of talking about good and bad shepherds. So it seems to me that John wants the reference to Hanukkah to work backwards as well as forwards, setting Jesus up as a good shepherd like Judas Maccabeus. This doesn't mean that Sukkot is forgotten entirely in the first half of chapter 10, and this is why a neat, tidy outline with sharp boundary lines fails to describe what John's doing. In chapter 10, the themes of Sukkot and Hanukkah overlap and blend as context for the Good Shepherd discourse. But Passover is still the festival that dominates as the symbolic backdrop of John's book. In 1155, the narrative skips ahead again from the festival of Hanukkah to a third Passover festival. Now the Passover of the Jews was near, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and were asking one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? Surely he will not come to the festival, will he?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that anyone who knew where Jesus was should let them know, so that they might arrest him. With this, John sets up the whole sequence of following episodes as taking place against the backdrop of a third Passover celebration. He goes out of his way to keep the festival front and center as he introduces the individual episodes too. At the start of the story of Mary anointing Jesus with perfume, John says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. Although this anointing doesn't actually happen during the festival, John wants to make sure that we read it together with the following stories against that Passover backdrop. Again, when John introduces the next episode of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, we find the same explicit reminder of the festival context. The next day, the great crowd that had come to the festival heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, so they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him. John wants to make sure that we understand. As Jesus is hailed by the crowds, he is arriving to bring about another exodus, like the one remembered at Passover. But John also wants us to keep in view the fact that he has been anointed, as if being prepared for death. So his role in this new exodus is shadowed by uncertainty. Is he arriving as the Good Shepherd, the leader who, like Moses, will deliver the people? Or is he being prepared to die like the lambs whose blood sheltered Israel and made their freedom from Egypt possible? As in the beginning of chapter 10, this last Passover also defies our neatly segmented outlines, because while the earlier festivals have worked to mark off subsections within the Book of Signs, the final Passover begins this way, but then breaks out of the Book of Signs and continues across the watershed boundary between chapters 12 and 13. In fact, the entire second half of the book, from 1155 onward, takes place on and around the third fateful Passover. Now, you'll notice that there are two sections in my diagram of John's Book of Signs that haven't yet been included in any of these festival subsections. Those parts, too, are given structure by references to Israel's sacred times, but the signals here are a bit more ambiguous, so it was important to establish first how John clearly uses sacred time to group the episodes in the rest of his narrative. Once we recognize this pattern, we can be more confident about what John is trying to do at the opening of chapter 5. After this, there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. It's a bit odd that John tells us a festival is happening, but doesn't tell us which one. Some have suggested that we should understand this as the Festival of Weeks, since it was by some accounts the most popular of the pilgrimage festivals, the festival. But given John's other explicit references elsewhere, this seems odd. It's like he wants us to keep in mind the calendar of sacred time, but doesn't want to draw on any particular festival as thematic context. It's not until verse 9 that we begin to see why. At the climax of Jesus' encounter with a chronically ill man, we read how he is healed. At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was a Sabbath. We can almost hear the collective gasp from John's audience. This healing that we've been following with bated breath was happening on the Sabbath? The whole episode in chapter 5 turns out to focus on this question of time. What is acceptable in God's sight on sacred days? So most scholars find here the explanation for the oddly cagey opening reference to a festival. Chapter 5, like the other parts of the Book of Signs, is given structure still by references to sacred time. In this case, though, the time John wants to serve as the episode's context is the Sabbath itself. Symbolically, John seems to imply not only that healing is allowed on the Sabbath, but that Jesus is the site where Israel can attain true Sabbath rest, true peace and wholeness, not just a pause from work, but the kind of wholeness and contentment Jesus gave to this man whose life had been dominated by his illness. So the sacred time that defines the context for chapter 5 is the Sabbath itself. But what about chapters 1 and 2, between the end of John's prologue and the first mention of the Passover in 2:13? There's no mention here of any festival, but readers of John have long noticed that the section is held together by prominent mentions of time. The section begins with John the Baptist explaining his mission as a witness to some Jerusalem Pharisees. The next episode then begins. The next day he saw Jesus coming toward him and declared, Here is the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. What follows up to 134 is John's testimony about Jesus, delivered now in Jesus' presence, so that his identity becomes clear to John's followers. We might not think twice about the time signal here, the next day, until, that is, a similar signal appears at the beginning of the next episode too. The next day, John was standing with two of his disciples. This third day sees the first of Jesus' disciples turn and begin to follow him. Then we find yet another time marker with the start of a fourth day. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. Once in Galilee, Jesus attracts more early disciples and discloses to them that he is Israel's long-expected rescuer. Finally, the wedding at Cana begins with a fourth time marker. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. The phrase, "on the third day," here must be counting from the previous episode, not from the beginning of the whole sequence. That means that this whole section, from the end of the prologue to the beginning of the first Passover, is set over 7 days, 1 week. Why would John make sure that we notice the sequence of 7 days? Some have seen here an allusion to the 7 days of creation, reinforcing the prologue's claim that Jesus is in fact the Word who created, come now to exercise his creative power by shining light in the world. Others have seen a reference to the Festival of Weeks, again, the one pilgrimage festival that's otherwise unmentioned in John. We might see a hint here that Jesus' activity is taking place in sacred time, generally. The sequence of days that contain his actions are not ordinary time. His presence here is something sacred. He is, as the prologue told us, the point where God's divine glory becomes visible, can be approached and encountered in the midst of the world. He is like a walking, talking tabernacle, bringing God's glorious presence into the midst of human life. So his presence makes time sacred, in the same way that festival days were sacred for Israel. These are specially prepared times, designed to make possible contact between God's glory and a disrupted, confused creation. What do we gain in the end by recognizing the way sacred time gathers the episodes in the Book of Signs into subsections? At the most basic level, this encourages us to read certain neighboring episodes as sets. Jesus' encounter with Nicodemus, John the Baptist's following testimony, and the encounter with the Samaritan woman are meant, it seems, to be taken together. So this draws our attention to the contrast between the ambivalent response of Nicodemus and the wholehearted embrace of the woman at the well. The holy leader in Jerusalem struggles to muster enough humility to accept Jesus' signs, but a sinful and marginal woman is far more open and ready. Since the healing of the official's daughter marks the end of this same section, that episode also takes on added significance. Here we see an enacted sign that Jesus is who he has claimed with Nicodemus and the Samaritan. Here we see the new life and living water begin to flow from Jesus as its source. But these sections do more than just frame the episodes they contain, encouraging us to read them together. As we've seen, the specific moments in Israel's sacred time that form the backdrop to each section come with their own symbolism and themes. Passover, Sukkot, Hanukkah, even the weekly Sabbath. And John has clearly arranged the episodes in each section so that the meaning of each sacred time mirrors the meaning of Jesus' words and actions in those episodes. So the sequence involving Nicodemus, the Samaritan woman, and the official's child is not just about different people responding to Jesus. It's about the dawn of the new Exodus, a liberation not from Egypt this time, but from the confusion and death that have corrupted the world in this age. The juxtaposition of Nicodemus and the woman takes on added irony, for a very unholy Samaritan outsider here begins to experience the liberation promised to Israel, while it remains an open question whether one of Israel's own leaders will be included. So when we recognize this structure in the Book of Signs, it allows us to read individual episodes as sets, and to understand those sets against the backdrop of the symbolism built into each sacred time. But we also gain one more insight. When we pull back and look at the Book of Signs as a whole, we begin to recognize that it makes an overarching implicit claim, that Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel's worship. This is, after all, what John told us at the end of his prologue. In Jesus, the Word met humanity face to face, like God met Moses in the inner chamber of the tabernacle. In Jesus, the divine glory that was found at the summit of Mount Sinai, the glory that filled the Holy of Holies in Israel's temple, was visible and accessible in a human being. It's the symbolic message of Jesus' first sign at Cana. Jesus takes the sacred institutions of Israel and fulfills them. He takes the jars used in ritual bathing, in preparing to enter sacred times and spaces, and changes their water into wine. None of this implies there was anything wrong with Judaism in the first place. There was nothing wrong, in John's view, with Israel's worship or her festivals, but they were never designed to be ends in themselves. The sacred times always looked forward to a fulfillment, when a new exodus would dawn and Israel would live in peace with God. The larger argument of John's Book of Signs is that Jesus brings that peace. Jesus is enacting that new exodus. Everything that Israel has been yearning for as she celebrated the festivals was now becoming a reality as they encounter the person of Jesus. Thanks for watching. I'm Ian Scott, and I'm Associate Professor of New Testament at Tyndale Seminary in Toronto, Canada. If you enjoyed this video, take a moment to click the like button and think about subscribing to my channel.